How's it going, everyone? So, this is Scant Touch This, proactively detect adversaries beyond your environment. My name is, wait, what's that? Best title of the conference? Oh, thank you, you're too kind. No, but seriously, we have a lot of great talks from a lot of really smart people, and it's not their fault that they're just not as clever as I am. My name's Aaron, and I work on the advanced practices team here at FireEye. Now, if you read the abstract from my session, then you already know that I'm here to talk about how we on the advanced practices team use network scanning for proactive detection. But if you haven't, then here's the deal. Nope. Yes. By leveraging your existing threat intelligence, you can use network scan data to detect adversaries before they initiate an intrusion. Now let me say that again. Before they initiate an intrusion, full stop. Not before they ransom your environment, not before they steal your and your customers' data, before they initiate an intrusion. But the first part of this sentence is equally as important as the last. Because without that existing knowledge about adversaries, this data set is just not going to be as valuable to you. You have to know something, you have to know what you're looking for before you can find it. Let me try this other clicker. Oh, here we go. So there are a few traditional data sets that researchers and analysts use for detection. But when it comes to being proactive about that detection, these data sets have some things about them that are not ideal. For example, malware repositories. Malware repositories require an uploader. Now, sometimes that uploader can represent an adversary who's writing malware and trying to test for AV detections. But typically, that uploader represents a victim. Similarly, for passive DNS, if the adversary decides to use a domain, and by the way, a lot of the times they don't, but if they do, then that domain has to be resolved enough for your passive DNS source to have observed it. And so in a lot of these cases, you are looking at data sets that have this inherent latency to them. There's a lot of things that have to happen before you even see it. And so you have to ask, is that really proactive at all? And I don't even have to mention, for most of you, I'm sure, about things like who-is privacy that are restricting the value of other data sets like registration data. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about network scan data and why it's so great. So first off, with network scan data, you have this wealth of information that you can gather from a host by scanning it. I'm talking about things like SSL certificates, things like HTTP response headers and bodies, service banners for other protocols, and port combinations. But I think what really makes this data set so great is that it circumvents a lot of this latency that I just talked about with these other data sets. And then not only that, this data set is much more comprehensive than these other data sets that I just mentioned. Let me explain that a bit. Think about how many malware samples or how many new domains show up every day. And then to continue that thought, think about all the malware samples that don't get uploaded because they haven't been found yet, or maybe because the organization that was a victim decided not to upload them as part of their investigation. But you know what they're not making more of? IP addresses. We know all of them, and there's actually not that many compared to malware samples and domains. And that's a really big advantage for us as analysts because we get a much better sense of the global prevalence of certain activity. Next slide. So let's jump into some examples. I'm gonna go through a bunch of examples, and the format's going to be pretty much the same for all of them, so I want to walk through that real quick before I get into this specific one. On the right-hand side of the screen, you're going to see the actual query that we use for Showdown or census. And then on the left-hand side, we have some stats about the queries that I'm talking about. The number in the gray circle represents the total number of hosts that we've observed over the past year for this query. And then below that, we further break it down to show how many hosts we've attributed to an APT group, how many we've attributed to a financial group, and how many we've attributed to an uncategorized or UNC group. So in this case, we're going to start off with Cobalt Strike because it's familiar. You heard Steve Stone earlier talking about Beacon. Now we're focusing on the other side of that, the other half of that coin, the Cobalt Strike servers. Here we have a Showdown query that finds Cobalt Strike by looking for specific HTTP headers while explicitly ignoring some, or I should say excluding some other headers. And what you might notice is that none of these headers stand out particularly for Cobalt Strike or anything malicious or suspicious for that matter. But as it turns out, this unique set of headers is actually a really, really good fingerprint for us to find Cobalt Strike servers before we see them at, say, a Mandiant IR or Managed Defense Investigation. Next slide, please. How about Metasploit? I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Metasploit. In contrast to the Cobalt Strike one, these Metasploit Pro is actually making it really easy for us. So we have a couple different ways to look at it. For example, we have a query that looks for the self-signed certificate that gets automatically generated. And then we also can look for that nice little icon that they give us with a big M on it. Now you might be wondering, what's that weird number hash thing for the second query? And that's a good question. It actually took us a while to figure that out ourselves. This is a murmur hash 3. And for whatever reason, it's what Showdown likes to use as their hash algorithm of choice. And you'll see it pop up in a few more examples down the line. But look at these numbers. Almost 3,000 servers detected this way. And you might think, it almost seems too easy, doesn't it? I don't know what to tell you, but we find a lot of them like that. Next slide, please. How about Empire? Here's another open source red team tool used by red teams and everyone else. Here we have a couple, we have a census query and then a matching Showdown query below it that find Empire by looking for a fake IIS-7 default page. Now you might be wondering, okay, they want to look like IIS-7, why didn't they just use the real IIS-7 page? Because you can see right there in green, the hash is different. Well, let's take a look and see if you can spot the differences. So first, we're going to look at a legitimate IIS-7 page. Take a look at the HTML, keep it in your mind, and now we'll go to the Empire IIS-7 page. Did you catch it? Let's go back to legitimate. Empire. Legitimate. As it turns out, the only difference here is that the legitimate page uses tabs for indentation, and the Empire page uses spaces. So close, and yet so far. But this brings me to what I really want to talk about today, which is, next slide, tabs versus spaces. That's right. No, I'm kidding. Next slide, please. Let's keep going. How about responder? Now, for the rest of my examples, because the numbers are a little bit smaller, instead of showing the breakdown for different types of groups, I'm just showing you groups that we've seen use these tools. Most notably for responder is APT28. Our query for responder looks for an HTTP 401 unauthorized response with a very specific date in it. Why do we look for that specific date? Well, because it's hard-coded into the source code. How's that for trash ticks, as we like to call them on advanced practices instead of tactics? And you can see there I have a link if you want to go look at the exact file, the exact line in the code where that shows up. like I said before, sometimes they just make it easy for you. Interestingly enough, we've also seen examples of responder where they have fixed that, and they don't, and it has a dynamic date instead of that hard-coded one. But we've got other queries for responder as well. Next slide, please. POSH-C2. Here's one that we've seen used by groups like APT33. We've got a couple different queries here for POSH-C2. The first one, or these are both census queries, actually. The first one looks for SSL metadata, and the second one looks for a very specific response body by the SHA-256 hash, as you can see there. Now, the point I want to make with this slide is that when we're able to have multiple indicators to find the same thing, we become more flexible on from the defender's point of view. So if the adversary decides that they want to tweak something, like for example, they want to change the date header in responder, we've still got ourselves covered with all these other queries. Next slide. Puppy rat, here's another one. Continuing this idea of redundancy, we've got a Showdown query and a census query that look for the exact same thing. So I just said it's cool when we look for different things. Why are we now looking for the exact same thing? The distinction here is that we're on two different sources. And when you can see from the breakdown in the numbers in the big gray circle there that they're different. So by using this same detection logic across multiple sources, we're actually increasing the value without doing any more work. Even though the overlap is high, the part of that that does not overlap is definitely worth it. And whenever we can, we try and duplicate our logic across as many sources as possible. Next slide, please. This is my last example, but it's probably my favorite. Probably just because of its simplicity. This is a weak signal Showdown query, and when I say weak signal, what I mean is this is a query that looks for something that's not inherently malicious. PowerShell, just because you see PowerShell doesn't mean that it's bad. However, weak signal also means that we can find things that we didn't have a specific detection for already. We can find that unknown evil. So this Showdown query, it is simply just looking for the string PowerShell.exe in the HTML response body from a regular old GET request to the root URI. And then we filter out some noise that we found along the way. We've actually had a lot of success with this. You can see here is an example of an APT33 payload that we found, I think, over the summer. Now, I could go on and on with examples all day. We got a lot of them. But let's look at the numbers overall. So we've been messing around with network scan data for about a year now. And these numbers are actually old already. I pulled these about a month ago. We're now over 800 total queries across 41 malware families, 58 threat groups, and well over 300,000 servers and counting. And I think this really speaks to not only the value of the data set, but the value of taking your existing threat intelligence and applying it. Next slide. So hopefully by this point, you're all thinking, hey, network scan data is pretty cool. And I would agree with you. But where do I get it? There are really two big buckets for getting scan data. You can do it yourself, or you can get it from a third party. If you get it yourself, there are plenty of good programs out there, things like MassScan, Nmap, whatever. And when you build it yourself, it gives you fine-grained control over how often you scan, what ports you scan, what protocols, the kind of data that you pull back. how you store it, and then how you're able to query that data. But of course, you also are taking on this enormous engineering and maintenance overhead, but that's a trade-off for that. On the other hand, you have third parties. You heard me talk a lot about Census and Showdown, and there are a lot of other third parties out there as well. And with third parties, you get basically the opposite. You get high amounts of data because they're scanning the entire internet all the time with relative ease. A lot of accessibility up front, not a lot of work up front. But then, of course, you're taking on whatever limited capabilities those sources have. So they might not scan everything that you want, or they might be slow, and you might need something really fast. Or you might need something a little more specific that these third parties are not offering. So for us on advanced practices, we like to use a combination. Next slide, please. Putting it all together, the first step, observe and collect data on adversaries and intrusions. This goes back to what I said on the very first slide. You have to know something about these adversaries before you can go out and find them before they find you. And the only way you're going to know things about them is by observing them. Then you identify patterns and semi-unique characteristics. You use those characteristics to craft queries. And then you monitor the results of those queries over time. The thing that I want you to take away from this slide, though, is that it's nothing new. You've probably all seen this, or you all do this every day. It's no different than the way you would treat creating a Yara rule or creating a Suricata rule. It's just a different data set to which we're applying this similar methodology. Next slide. So the moral of the story, network scan data is super valuable for proactive detection. You can get it yourself, or you can get it from a third party. And there's value in both strong and weak signals, looking for the things that you know are bad, and looking for the things that you don't even know about yet. But you have to know what to look for. You have to know, and I keep saying this, I probably sound like a broken record by now, but you have to know about the adversary before you can find them proactively. And that's one of the great things that I enjoy so much about being on the advanced practices team, because we are engaged with the adversary every single day, whether it's through Mandiant IRs, managed defense investigations, or through our thousands of product customers. And that's pretty much it. Thank you. So I got about 5 minutes for questions. If you have any, there are 2 microphones up in front. Otherwise, I'll get off the stage. All right. Oh, okay.
Okay. You talked about how you could use these data sets to identify threat actors before they attempt an intrusion. What other meta information do you use for that?
So that, if I'm hearing you correctly, what other information besides network scan data are we using for proactive detection? That's definitely a good question. So a lot of it comes from those other data sets that I mentioned before. They're not ideal, and they're a lot slower. But sometimes we use those data sets to supplement things like network scan data, like registration information, passive DNS. Some of those, it's almost like if network scan data is your first indicator, a lot of these servers that we found in that 300,000 number, we'll find them, and then we'll tag them up, we'll make sure they're modeled correctly, and then we'll just see how it goes along the way, because we're not always 100%, can't always be 100% confident, but you have an indicator. And as you start to use those other data sets, and you overlap and you get that more and more confidence, eventually we usually get to a point of attribution. And we got one more question here.
Um, what do you do with IPv6?
Could you repeat that? I didn't hear it.
What do you do with IPv6?
Great question. Yeah. So we focus primarily on IPv4 because that's what adversaries primarily focus on. I mean, I could probably count on one hand the amount of times I've seen IPv6 used in an intrusion since I've been here at FireEye. And the other flip side of that is that a lot of organizations don't even allow IPv6 in their environment anyways. So the short answer is we don't. Yeah, his question was, are any of these queries going to be shared in public? There's about 12 of them that I just shared with you, and I would love to share more, and I hope that we are able to do that. Nothing is like concrete planned, but I don't see why not. Same way we share Yara rules or other things. All right. Thank you, everybody.